Up until now, we push government into the background by shutting it down. But like all governments, eventually it gets back up and running. Now we're going to bring government back into the picture. The government's going to have a budget constraint today and in the future, in parallel to private individuals who also have budget constraints now and in the future. So if you think about today, government spends G on goods today, and T is the amount of revenue that it raises. The difference between those is borrowing. So that's government debt. In the future, government also has some spending that it undertakes, but now it has to not only pay off the debt, that's the B term, but it also has to pay interest on the debt. So that's the R times B term. And they're going to have to do this by raising sufficient taxes. There's some definitions that are used in discussions about fiscal policy. The first is what's called the primary surplus. So we can think of T minus G as the surplus net of any interest on the debt. R times B is debt service. This is the interest that has to be paid on the debt. This is the object that Republicans argued we could continue to satisfy even if we didn't adjust the debt ceiling and open the government again. The measure of the surplus that gets discussed most often, though, is the primary surplus including this debt service. So that's called the gross surplus. So what do these numbers look like in the US? Well, since World War II, what we see is the very biggest, well, first I should tell you that the green and red lines are the primary deficit. So remember that that's just T minus G. And the red line is T minus G minus debt service. And then the blue line is the debt service itself. And that is on the right axis. Surplus measures are as percentages of GDP, and the net interest, this RB, is a percentage of total outlays by the government. So what you can see is that World War II was when both the primary and the gross surplus were the largest. It was also a time when interest on the debt was extremely high. After World War II, there were surpluses for a while. And what you can see here is by looking at the green line that there were primary surpluses for much of the time up until, let's say the mid-70s. There have been some primary surpluses since then. In particular, this is during the Clinton administration. But in general, we have been running, since the mid-70s, we've been running primary deficits. And the gross deficit has been positive for most of the post-war period. So the measure of deficit that includes interest payments on the debt. Now, one thing that you'll notice, I misspoke. This was a time, the World War II was a time when interest payments on the debt were extremely low. I was reading off the wrong axis. So they were on the order of maybe 2% of outlays. They got quite high during the Reagan administration in the early 80s. And then they came down quite dramatically. This is because there was a decline in the debt. Now, even though we've had a pretty dramatic increase in deficits, as you can see, due to this recession, and also in debt, debt service has been quite low, and that's because interest rates have been so low in the United States. So remember that this net interest is the interest rate times the amount of debt outstanding. So even if you have a lot of debt outstanding, which the US does now have, if the interest rate is low enough, then the net interest is going to be quite low. Okay, now we can take that budget constraint in the future, which we wrote as TF equals GF plus 1 plus R times B, and just rewrite it. And what you see is that the value of debt, remember that this is the debt that is sold in the first period, in the initial period today. That value is determined by the primary surplus divided by the interest rate. What is this? This is the present value of the primary surplus. This is an extremely important point. We will be coming back to this throughout the rest of the semester. But the message of equation 5 is that debt will derive its value from the present value of primary surpluses. And we could generalize this. So in an economy that lasts forever, the value of debt today is just equal to this infinite sum. But what is this infinite sum? It's just the present value of primary surpluses. So what we have up in equation 5 is just a special case of this where the whole future is ignored and we only look at one period. We can combine the two budget constraints of the government and we get what's called the present value constraint of the government. So what's on the left-hand side is the present value of government spending, and the right-hand side is the present value of taxes. Now this is analogous to the present value constraint of the household, which, as we've seen, says that the present value of consumption equals the present value of after-tax income. But if you combine these two, so you use equation 3 to substitute for the present value of taxes in equation 6, what you get is, this is the present value form of the national income accounting identity. Accounting identity, which you have seen as y equals c plus g. But we have a y equals c plus g, we have a yf equals c plus g, and so what we can do is combine these and we get that the present value of consumption equals the present value of income net of the present value of government purchases. So in other words, what the private sector can consume in present value equals the present value of income less the present value of what the government consumes. So there's some implications that flow directly from these equations. If we ask, what are the effects of government financing in this model? What you can see is that households don't care whether they get taxed today or they get taxed in the future. What they care about, and this comes out of equation 6, is the present value of taxes. But the present value of taxes is completely nailed down by the present value of spending. So the timing of taxes, whether you get taxed today or taxed tomorrow, doesn't matter to consumers. All that matters is what their total taxation is. That therefore means that in this model, the choice of debt versus taxation is going to be irrelevant. And we will talk about this in some detail. This is what is called the Ricardian equivalence theorem, and we will turn to that next.